2 days before one of the first major battles of the war in Vietnam, my only brother Pete was killed there. I had just turned 15. Pete's death was widely reported, but it so traumatized my family that we didn't discuss what had happened to him. Before long, we stopped talking about him at all. Between July 1963, when my brother arrived in Southeast Asia as a civilian volunteer with a little-known non-governmental organization called International Voluntary Services, or IVS, and November 1965, he wrote dozens of letters home. As a teenager, I didn't pay close attention to them, but I was aware that Pete routinely mentioned names I heard on the news: Ziem, Lodge, Rusk, Key, Westmoreland, and McNamara. Pete was 24 when he was killed. When I reached that age, I longed to learn more about the young man I had known only from the vantage point of a little sister. I asked my mother if I could read his letters again. She told me they had all been destroyed in a basement flood. My connection with Pete was lost forever, or so I thought. In 2004, 64 letters surfaced. Those letters led me to others, and eventually I had 175. Only by reading them and talking with many kind, generous individuals who remembered Pete did I come to know once again my wonderful big brother. I know him better now, in fact, than when he was alive. Many people have suffered a loss like mine. Someone we loved died in a war zone. Thousands, perhaps millions of us waited for someone who did not return from a faraway land. We have struggled with various degrees of success to integrate our loss. Life has not stopped for us, even if we went forward with a chamber deep within sealed up. Some of us have not told our closest friends or spouse about a person we once mourned, or still mourn. And then I cite several events that happened that helped me come to terms with my brother's death. None of these turning points, meaningful as they were, matched the significance of discovering my brother's letters. What they meant to me, where they led me, and how they changed me is the substance of finding Pete. 2 days into my 15th year, I lost my brother and the freedom to talk about him. This is the story of what I found and how I found it. All IVS recruits spent their first month studying Vietnamese. Pete picked it up quickly. His language ability enabled him to do things like translate mimeograph machine instructions into Vietnamese and to make friends. He bought a motorcycle so he wouldn't have to share a Jeep with his station mate and could get around more easily. He designed an irrigation windmill for a hamlet that badly needed water for crops. Word traveled, and other hamlets asked Mr. Tall American if they could have a windmill too. Pete's contract with IVS ended in the summer of 1965 after U.S. combat troops arrived that March. He came home on leave and returned 2 months later. He wrote, "Saigon is awash with green uniforms." He was promoted to supervisor for the Mekong Delta. He told my grandmother it would be safer there. I was immersed in Pete's world, and it began to dawn on me that I needed to go back to Vietnam. I had been there in 1991, and there's a chapter about that trip in the book. So in 2006, I returned as a delegate of a group that builds libraries, and its founder, Chuck Toish, is in the audience. Chuck was on a strict timetable, but he was very gracious to allow time for me to visit the places that mattered to me. He agreed that we could stop in a hamlet I'd read about online, whose women were expert weavers, and they were of the Cham tribal minority. Their village was very remote, so we had to stop several times along the way before we pulled in to Ming Yep. We pulled up to the first house where we saw a loom. I saw some beautiful weavings inside and began to look at them while Jim, another man with us, was making friends with 2 sisters. Suddenly, Chuck realized he'd left a suitcase behind in our hotel. In an instant, he was in the van with our driver, leaving Song, our interpreter, and Jim and me in the hamlet. I bought some weavings, and Song and I walked across the street to another home with a loom, and I took the woman's picture and bought a silk runner. And then, for no apparent reason, Song said to me, "Did you notice it's much hotter on this side of the street?" And it was almost 10 degrees hotter. It felt very hot there. And he said, "I think we'd better go back to that other place, and it's just cooler over there." So we went back to the first place, and by this time a third sister had arrived. So the other sister and I sat down together, and if Chuck had been with us, what came next would never have happened. But he would not be back for at least half an hour, and there was nothing to do but bide the time. So I'll read from the book. Looking toward the weavings inside, I told the young woman that my brother had bought blankets like these 40 years ago. She said her mother and grandmother had a good American friend a long time ago, before the soldiers came. My mother say, "He speak our Cham language," she said. I knew Pete spoke some Cham. My antenna went up. He was tall, she said, and the way her mother described his hair, it was just like mine. He came here on his motorcycle, she continued. One day he told her mother to put all of the weavings into the biggest basket she had. Then he took her to a Cham temple to sell them. She was afraid to go, but he told her it would be all right. "You come with me," he told her. She sold everything in her basket. The young woman, whose name I now knew was Cam, told me, "Sometimes my mother say it too dangerous for you, but he say, I don't care, I take you, come with me." I turned to Song. "Are you listening to this?" "Yes," he nodded, clearly amazed. Then she said, "He go away and he never come back." Hearing the question in her voice, I told her Pete had moved to the Mekong Delta and been killed there. She raised her hand to cover her open mouth. Chuck and our driver pulled up. I went to the van, opened my suitcase, and removed Pete's picture. When I handed it to Cam, she looked at his face and back to mine. "This is for your mother," I said. "Please tell her Pete's sister came back." The way I structured the book is in alternating chapters, and half of the chapters are the story of my long quest to learn who my brother was and what his life in Vietnam was like, and the other half is the reconstruction of Pete's life in Vietnam based on the 175 letters that I found. The first, I'm sure you'd like to hear some of Pete's letters now, so I'll read a brief excerpt from just 2 letters. Pete wrote the first of these in 1965 when he was working with refugees who had fled U.S. artillery fire. They had lost their possessions and their livelihood, so Pete asked them what they knew how to do so he could help them do it. They said they knew how to make rice wine, a whiskey really, so he scrounged around for supplies and visited a distillery and wrote, "I'll never again enjoy rice wine unless I drink it far from Ba Xuyen. The water they use to make the mash is dipped out of a murky-looking canal instead of a mountain spring. The boilers are made of galvanized tin painted over with aluminum paint. Have you ever heard of such a thing?" As if that wasn't enough, there were all these diseased inebriates standing around. To my horror, I was told they were the workers. It's a wonder people around here are still alive. Me, for instance. Then, in the other excerpt I'll read, Pete was visiting a hamlet on May 1st, 1965, because they were having a celebration after installing one of his windmills. There were 2 young men in the hamlet whom Pete had not seen before. May 1st was a holiday when Viet Cong soldiers were allowed to return to their homes. And he wrote, "As we drank beer, they were very friendly and asked more than the usual amount of pointed questions, wanting to know about my job, my relationship to the Vietnamese and American governments, my opinion of province officials, and, as usual, my appraisal of Vietnamese womanhood. I'd never before had such a thorough grilling at the hands of 2 young Vietnamese peasants. I'll never know for whose side Chu and An will give their support in the final crucial struggle, but I will always consider myself lucky to have been able to contribute directly and indirectly to Vietnamese understanding of our U.S. role and of the issues they themselves must decide upon." And with that last sentence, in conclusion, I'll say that I think Pete put his finger on a key issue, and it's as timely today as it was when he wrote that in 1965, because, as we all know, our country is still grappling with what our role should be in developing countries.